At the same time, there was the Rodney King trial. The police officers involved in that case, in the state trial, they were acquitted. And then, of course, O.J. Simpson was found not guilty. Mm-hmm. So the political climate at the time was not good for the district attorney's office. Yeah. And then the Menendez brothers were also, there was a mistrial. So there was a lot of political pressure for the DA's office to try to get a victory. Mm-hmm. And then there's also, complaints from critics that what we're seeing here today is also involved in politics because the district attorney of Los Angeles County, George Gascon, is running for re-election. And he is apparently behind in the polls to his challenger, Nathan Hochman. And critics out there are saying that is the only reason this has all come about, is because of George Gascon trying to get some positive publicity leading up to the election. Yeah, and let's check in with Attorney Brian Claypool, very knowledgeable of this case and a lot of cases. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, sure. Happy to be with you.
So your thoughts on this happening, period?
Yeah, look, I know some people are saying that this is political motivation for George Gascon, but remember, it was initiated by lawyers for Menendez, and that was triggered by new evidence, right? So we had this note that one of the Menendez brothers had written about being sexually abused. The aunt brought this forward. So you had new evidence that was coming forward. So that's what triggered all this. And then what Gascon's office is saying is, look, 20 years later, we as a community view child sexual abuse differently now, and that could be a reason to reduce this from, sentencing based on first-degree murder to manslaughter. So I do think there is some legitimacy associated with this, but at the same time, if there is a hearing on this, it needs to be carefully and thoughtfully done.
Well, Brian, what would be the timeline? So if the district attorney comes out today and says the Menendez brothers should be resentenced, what's the timeline to, getting in front of a judge making a ruling, and then possibly the Menendez brothers being freed from prison?
Right, great question. So there already is a hearing date. I think it's set for November 26th. It's the end of November, where a judge is going to hear this matter. So Gascon making a decision, let's say hypothetically Gascon says we are going to recommend, right, resentencing. Then in late November, Glenn, when the judge hears this matter, he or she is going to decide what they want to do. Do we want to do a resentencing or not? Remember, a judge doesn't have to do what George Gascon says. Judge doesn't have to do what the lawyers for the Menendez brothers say. So a judge will decide at this hearing at the end of November, do we go forward with the resentencing? And then that judge will then set another hearing date, I would think, to hear evidence. I highly doubt what some people are saying, which is a judge at the end of November is simply going to say, okay, we're going to do a resentencing, and by the way, we're letting these guys out of jail today, right? Some people have said that. I think there's going to have to be then a separate hearing either in December or early next year probably, in which you hear actual evidence, right? You hear testimony, for example, from a forensic psychologist that will talk about the effect of child sexual abuse on somebody's mind. You'll hear about the note, right? Is that note, does it come into evidence or not? That's something a judge should look at. There's an evidentiary issue with the note. So again, there's going to be hearing end of November, but that's to decide whether the judge is going to go forward with a resentencing hearing. That'll be determined based in part about what Gascon does today. But I highly doubt that at the end of November that the Menendez brothers are simply going to walk free.
Brian, you are a child abuse and civil rights litigator. You have won huge cases, settlements for child sexual abuse. And one of the issues in this case is alleged sexual abuse continually over the years by Jose Menendez, allegedly on these boys at that time. Some are saying that, like the second trial, when all that evidence was left out, that it was made up, that no one could believe that young boys are sexually abused. It was typically more of a female issue. How have you seen things change in the court system when it comes to the child sexual abuse?
Well, I think child sexual abuse is taken much more seriously now. I think there's been a lot of analysis from a psychological standpoint, for example, on what is the effect, Lou, on kids. Think about it. Think about this. Kids are helpless. They don't really have a lifeline when they are abused. And think about this. This is a parent, right? And by the way, a very prominent parent. So that's what you've got to put yourself in the shoes of a kid, a teenager, and they're going to go against their parent who's in the Hollywood scene. And that's hard for a child to come forward. So let's talk briefly about what happens to these kids, because I have a huge case now with adult victims of child sexual abuse, just like the Menendez brothers. And Lou, I have literally had a handful of clients who over the years who've held on to all of this have attempted suicide. Some have tried to kill themselves. Some have gotten in trouble with the law. And there really is a connection between the abuse that takes place as a child and as an adult in behavior, right? And that's something that I think that the court is really taking a close look at here. And we've seen it in some other cases too. I mean, it really skews your mind. You're not thinking straight. You don't really feel like anybody will believe you. You feel shamed, humiliated, and sometimes you go to extreme measures. I'm not justifying the shooting, but I will tell you that a lot of victims we work with, they do feel helpless, and some of them don't even have the drive to live.
Brian, I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but let's get back to that note or letter that was written to one of the aunts claiming that their father was sexually abusing them and their mother knew about it. Was that note part of the evidence that was left out after the first case and the second case, or was it something that surfaced just recently?
Yeah, that's a great question, Glenn. That evidence was just recently. Yeah, it was near the. I believe the aunt of one of the Menendez brothers who wrote the note said, "Oh my gosh, look at this! We have this." And so the argument is that this letter should have been considered in the second trial. It was. Remember, the judge in the second trial wasn't even letting in hardly any evidence. He wasn't buying into the sexual abuse allegations at all. And I think that's why we're taking a close look at this again too. But that's a great question. It's just recently, newly discovered evidence. But one thing we should talk about real quick too is, remember, there was somebody else that came forward from a boy band. Yeah. I think it was a Puerto Rican band, and they claimed this young man claimed that he also was abused. I know that's not the same as the note, but I think that generated some traction too. That maybe this is legitimate. Maybe the father did do this, and we need to take a close look at it. And Glenn, look, if you analyze the detail of that note, it's pretty chilling. Yeah. It's not just a one-sentence note. I mean, it's a note. And think about this. This is interesting. A lot of victims have trouble disclosing. They really are quiet about disclosing. They're embarrassed to say it, right? And he doesn't really say exactly what he's afraid of, right? But he's saying he's afraid of his dad. Is it going to happen again? Is he going to come in the room again? I mean, there's something to that effect. It's pretty chilling, the detail in the note that is kind of reaching out for help. So I do think that, this evidence should be looked at. But again, to your point, we also have to make sure that the note is authentic, and this isn't something that was just generated to get a resentencing.
Brian, also, too, as a litigator, and the only knowledge I have from this is, extensively watching this documentary and reading a lot and seeing the show that was based on these murders. The behavior of the boys after the murders, going out and spending a bunch of money and lying, some say that was evidence that they did it and they should stay in jail. Others say because of the alleged sexual abuse, it's a form of PTSD. And what I heard you saying is that sometimes they don't know how to act. They act out in other ways because of the abuse.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I think even George Gascon came out the other day, and didn't he say that half of his camp is, not in favor of resentencing for the reasons you're mentioning because of the behavior after the murders, and then half of the Gascon camp is in favor of resentencing? And I think you're right. If you look at this strictly on optics, right, how does somebody, go out and spend money when they just killed their parents, right? But we have to look back at the age of these young men at the time. And you're right, PTSD is real. Trauma is real. And it distorts your ability to evaluate a situation in a rational manner. And think about this too, Lou. If it's true that these boys had been abused, right, at least one of them, if not both, and this went on for years. And this is a parent. And by the way, a parent, that's even more dramatic.
Yeah.
The person you're supposed to trust the most and who brought you into this world, then it's almost like you're living in a prison for all these years, right? And that's what a lot of child abuse victims feel. They're in prison. They can't talk to anybody about it. Nobody's protecting them. And then all of a sudden, they've eliminated the alleged perpetrator, and now they're out in the real world. Wow, we're free now. We could do whatever we want. We're going to go spend money. We're going to do this. And you know, one argument could be made that irrational behavior of spending money like that after killing your parents actually supports the fact that these young men were really, you know, traumatized by the ongoing abuse, which potentially explains this behavior, if that makes sense. So I think it can cut both ways.
Okay, just to clarify, that was Ray Rossello, who was a member of Menudo back in the 1980s, that said that he was also sexually abused by Jose Menendez. Brian, let me ask you this question. So if and when the Menendez brothers are in fact released from prison, if that happens, is there a case for them to come back after the state with a lawsuit for what has happened to them and the fact that they've spent, you know, all this time in jail, and I mean, most of their life now?
Yeah. The Menendez brothers would not have a civil rights case against law enforcement. Law enforcement has a pretty broad immunity in these kind of cases, but the reason why is because they admitted killing their parents, right? So usually when you see these civil rights cases, it's when somebody is wrongfully convicted, right? They're wrongfully arrested, and then they're convicted when they didn't really do the crime. That's where you see these cases for, you know, false arrest, and you see these multi-million-dollar settlements and verdicts. But here you've got two young men that are saying, yeah, I did it, right? And that's why there's not going to be a retrial, by the way, too. Let's talk about that real quick. Some people have said, oh, there might be a new trial. That's never going to happen because these two guys admitted doing the killing, and the jury's already determined they did it, right? So here they said they admitted doing it, so law enforcement didn't do anything wrong in arresting them. I think the issue, the only potential interesting issue, Glenn, now that you ask, is again, I'm not picking on his lawyers, but remember we were talking about that second trial. You know, did the Menendez brothers lawyers in the second trial raise these issues of trying to get in the evidence of the child sexual abuse in that second trial? Did they try to get in evidence that they did have? Because I know all we've heard is, oh, the judge didn't let it in. Well, hopefully his lawyers made a record of that. If they did, and then the judge said it's not coming in, and you were going to jail, then you've got no recourse at that point. You can't go after a judge, right? Judges have nearly absolute blanket immunity as well. So it's too hard to go after a judge, to go after law enforcement. The only angle I could see is if something happened in that second trial where there should have been evidence brought up of child abuse, their lawyers had a chance to do it and didn't do it, then maybe the Menendez brothers have some kind of argument of inadequate, legal counsel to try to get some kind of civil compensation.
Well, a couple of things. I know in the second trial, Eric testified, Lyle did not, because of the recordings that a woman who I guess they had created a friendship and started doing some writing in an effort to write a book, and she released those recordings, and so he was going to be able to get cross-examined on that, and there was some damning evidence in those recordings. So really interesting to that point. Then if we look at Leslie Abramson, she's the attorney that represented Eric. She's in her 80s now, basically has said that the shows on Netflix are a piece of blank, and has, in her words, and has not been in favor of that and said the jury spoke, let it be. Your thoughts on that?
That's a really interesting comment coming from a lawyer for the Menendez brothers, and let's back up. I mean, some of these docuseries and documentaries, some of these have actually triggered legitimate investigations that have led to either somebody being exonerated based on a wrongful charge, or some. There was a recent case of I can't remember the name of it, but of a guy that on these serial killings that was actually convicted based on a comment he made, like in a docuseries. So let's start with that. I wouldn't immediately trash these documentaries to start with. Number one, and number two, I do find that comment, a bit troubling. That gets to my point. Like, what evidence did she work with in that second trial? Because as a criminal, I do criminal defense work too. As a criminal defense lawyer in a case like that, you absolutely, Lou, have to be looking at the child sexual abuse. Why? Because your clients are on trial for first-degree murder. They're going to go to jail the rest of their lives without the possibility of parole. And in California and in most other states, we have a legal defense called diminished capacity, right? And what that means is what we've been talking about, right? That means that the perpetrator, the killer, right? The two boys here, they had endured so much trauma that their emotional balance had been derailed, right? And that therefore that defeats. Remember, first degree murder, you have to intend to kill somebody, you plan it out, and that's what I'm trying to say here. Is that in that second trial, where was that evidence of that abuse? Because their defense lawyers should have been arguing that because of all this abuse, it defeats the intent element, right? And because of that, the charge then is reduced from first-degree murder down to manslaughter. And that's really what we're talking about today. That's what all these arguments are. That's why, just so your viewers know, that's why these boys could walk. Because if it was manslaughter instead of first-degree murder, then they probably already served enough time. But this diminished capacity defense it's available in most every state, and that's what a good criminal defense lawyer should have been arguing in that second case. I'm not sure of all the evidence, but aren't you guys surprised by that comment too? It's like, wow.
Yeah, especially coming from their defense attorney. And another thing too about diminished capacity, if I remember correctly, they were also of a state of mind fearing for their lives because they had become adults. They were terrified that their parents were actually going to kill them to cover up the alleged abuse.
That's a great point. That's an excellent point, because that gets to my point, which is diminished capacity is available. In fact, there's a case in Arkansas. I don't know if you heard about that, where a father was worried that his teenage daughter was going to be raped again by a guy was going on trial for having raped her, and goes and finds her, in the car, and then there's a confrontation. He ends up shooting him and killing the guy. It's in Arkansas, and I commented on that case, and you would argue the same argument there, Glenn. Very similar, that the father is he's fearing that his daughter is going to be harmed, right, by this guy, and he ends up killing this guy. Here, you raise a great point. These two boys are legitimately, worried about their well-being, and they're trying to protect themselves. And you couple that with if the sexual abuse did take place, then that qualifies for an argument that their minds are not thinking rationally. Just to make this a little bit more easy for people to understand, it just basically means that you're not able to really grasp, what you're doing. You can't form the requisite intent to go out and murder somebody because your mind is so impaired from trauma, PTSD, from fear of being harmed, that you pull the trigger when you really didn't intend to do that. And that it is an important component of this case. I wouldn't minimize this or trivialize this at all. These defenses are made in cases in which defendants have endured a lot of trauma.
And we've seen their behavior in prison as well. They're saying they've been model prisoners, getting their degrees. And apparently Lyle works directly with some of the other inmates who also have been sexually abused, and is using that platform to spread good where he is. And so I think that may be taken into account as well by the judge, if this in fact is allowed to be looked at.
Yeah, that's an important point, because they have been model citizens in jail, and that would certainly be factored into sentencing as well. To have them potentially released, if there's a resentencing hearing. But let's talk about another quick point. It's like, I think it's easy for a lot of people across the country that are watching this to have a knee-jerk reaction, right? What do I mean by that? Well, all these kids, these are two, spoiled young men from an affluent family, and, they got rid of the parents, and then they wanted to go out and spend a bunch of money. But you also want to look back at their prior criminal record, right? Because that gets into what we've been talking about. What's the effect? What's the effect of child sexual abuse? And I've been working on these cases for 15 years, and I know. But my point is, these two young men didn't have a prior criminal record, and I think that gravitates in their favor, right? If you think about it, because if they have been getting in trouble all of their lives, right, and then all of a sudden they murder their parents and say, "Oh, I'm blaming it on the abuse," right? That might not have as much traction, but these kids hadn't been in trouble, leading up to the murders, and I think that does kind of support the argument that Glenn even mentioned that they do fear, for their lives, and they can't think rationally, and I know it's hard for some folks to really grasp this, but think about back in the time when you're a teenager or you're a young adult, and you're having something done to you by someone in a position of authority, right? Someone, who's here, it's your parent, right? And you as a young person are supposed to go to somebody else to say, hey, this is happening to me. Like, you're going to hold off on that for a couple of reasons. A, you're shamed, you're humiliated. You don't want people to know that. And then number 4, the biggest one is you fear nobody's going to believe you, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes, I'm telling you, sometimes these abuse victims feel no other recourse they have than to eliminate the threat. Again, I'm not condoning what happened here, but I'm just trying to give your viewers some kind of glimpse into the a lens of what victims of sexual abuse might be thinking at the time. But again, they were not like unsavory young adults leading up to this, and I think that's what their lawyers are going to argue as well if they do get a resentencing hearing.
All right, you're looking live again for this news conference. This is the room where it's going to be held. It was supposed to start at 1:30. Again, District Attorney George Gascon expected to announce that the Menendez brothers should be resentenced. Obviously, a large crowd of media in the room, including our own Corrine Winter, as well as family members from the Menendez family who are supporting the Menendez brothers getting released from prison after being resentenced. And as Brian Claypool told us, a hearing on this matter actually won't take place until the end of November. I think it said the 25th or the 26th, 29th. And then, another hearing probably won't take place until probably sometime after the first of the year. So it's not like they're going to walk out of prison today or next week.
Yeah, Glenn, if I could jump in real quick, just to clarify. So at that hearing, and thank you, Lou, for clarifying that on the 29th. Remember, at that hearing, the judge has one decision to make. Like, are we going to resentence or not, right? And then from that would launch then, let's say the judge says, yes, I'll entertain resentencing. My prediction is that then he or she is going to then set another hearing sometime a couple of months out to let both sides get evidence. I think what you're hearing is a lot of talk that I don't think is reality, which is I'm hearing a lot even on national news. Oh, the Menendez brothers are going to be released at the end of November at this hearing. And I really don't think that that's going to happen. I think that that's not a responsible analysis. I don't think any judge is going to go into a hearing on the 29th and say, okay, we're going to have a resentencing, but we're not going to do like a formal evidentiary hearing, and I'm just going to let these guys go. I just want to make that clear. This judge has to decide first, is there going to be resentencing or not? What does that judge rely on? They're relying on what the Menendez lawyers have submitted to the court, right? And that's what you're all waiting for now. Then the second prong is, what's the district attorney going to do, right? Because if the DA Gascon says, we're not for resentencing, then the judge is going to consider that on the 29th and probably won't let it go forward, right? But then if Gascon says today, which I think he will, or else he's not going to do some big, dog and pony press conference, I think he's going to say we recommend it, then the judge will consider that, right, on the 29th and likely decide, let's do a resentencing. But then what does that look like? It's not what you're hearing everybody say, oh, they're just going to let them walk out of jail. It's likely going to be then the responsible way to do that in our judicial process would be then to set another hearing a few months out, let both sides gather evidence to submit to the court, and like I said, I think what's important here, which we need to see, I think we need to preserve the integrity of the judicial process too, right? Me as a long-term trial lawyer, I'm a little bit concerned about that. I'd like to see if there is a judge saying we need a resentencing. I'd like to see not that they're just released that day. I'd like to see a hearing, right?
Yeah.
2-3 months down the road. Let's see. Let's have the Menendez team submit testimony from a credible forensic psychologist to talk about that.
Excuse me, Brian. George Gascon is now at the podium, so let's listen in.
You bet.
Gascon wants to do is have them sentenced for murder, 50 years to life with a possibility of parole, because they were under the age of 26. In fact, they were 19 and 21 years old at the time of the murder. Brian Claypole, I want to bring you back in here. One point he made that if they're up for parole, that means they would go before a parole board who may or may not necessarily agree with this, or not.
Yeah. Hey, Glenn, great to be back with you. I mean, first of all, a judge at the end of November has to make a decision, right? I mean, George Gascon is not the judge. He's making what's called a recommendation to the court. And we're not surprised. I think we talked a little bit earlier about this. Not surprised at all that his office is agreeing with the resentencing, but there's got to be a hearing now at the end of November. Then an independent judge has to decide whether to adopt what George Gascon wants to do and have a resentencing. That's the first decision. If the judge says yes, then you're right. Then they're not going to get out of jail at that point in time. There's got to be a parole hearing. There's got to be, information submitted to the parole board. And then the parole board would have to make a decision on that that would be months down the road.
If the judge is basically approving and moving it forward, is that something that influences the parole hearing and the board?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, just to be clear too, this isn't like a magical thing where Gascon gets on and says, "Hey, we recommend resentencing," and then on November 29th, the Menendez brothers are walking free. That's not how our judicial system works. First of all, Gascon is making a recommendation. Will that help the judge decide to resentence? Absolutely. Whenever a district attorney is saying, "We agree with resentencing," it's hard then for the judge hearing it to say no. So at the end of November, on the 29th, I think you said, Lou, there'll be a hearing. That judge has to determine whether to move forward with resentencing. Once that decision is made then, Lou and Glenn, then the judge has to decide, what does that look like? Are we going to resentence or not? In my opinion, there still has to be likely some kind of hearing, some kind of evidentiary hearing before a judge decides, yes, we are going to resentence or not. And then after evidence is submitted to the court, then I believe the judge makes a decision and says, yes, we're going to resentence. And if the judge adopts what Gascon says, then to Glenn's point, then you go to a parole board and then seek to have these two young men released immediately because, as Gascon said, they've already served more than enough time for a murder charge as opposed to first degree. In other words, what Gascon's saying is this is second degree murder, not first degree. What's the difference? First degree requires malice, right? It requires malice. You're evil. You wanted to kill your parents. You shot them and shot them multiple times. Second degree removes malice. And that's where the child abuse fits in. And that's what Gascon's saying, that, hey, it's 50 years to life and they're eligible for parole now.
Yeah, in fact, they've served nearly 35 years. Again, Gascon said no universal agreement in the district attorney's office over this issue. So let me ask you this. We got an election coming up. He's running for re-election against Nathan Hochman. If, in fact, Gascon loses the election, and he is behind in the polls right now, and he did mention that somebody from his office may come and
I would also
all right,
like
we're going to go back to the news conference. We'll come back.
Let's bring back in trial attorney and media personality Brian Claypole to discuss a little bit about this. You just saw the question answer back and forth. One of the interesting things that I thought Gascon said is that while reviewing these prison files, it wasn't really about the original crime, Brian. It was more about focusing on the person they have been and their rehabilitation, and also can they be released safely back into society.
can't hear it. Is he? I cannot.
Brian, can you hear us?
Oh, so maybe Brian's not
I'm not
hearing us
hearing.
yet. So Brian was speaking with us earlier
hearing
and explaining a little bit about like what will happen next, and we just heard a little bit about that while Gascon was speaking. Basically, the judge has to hear. Gascon has recommended to the court for resentencing. Then a judge has to then hear and decide to adopt that resentencing, and that's it's supposed to be happening on November 29th. And then, depending on what the judge decides, the decision will then go to a parole hearing and ultimately to a parole board.
And that first hearing again will be on the 29th. And but this is a process, as Brian Claypool told us. This is not going to happen overnight.
Yes. And Brian, now that you can hear us. Hello.
Yeah, hello.
Hey.
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, I mean, Gascon said a lot here. He said one thing really interesting, that when he was making his decision, reviewing the prison files, wasn't just about the original crimes here. Basically, they're focused on, have they been rehabilitated? How have they behaved behind bars in prison all these years? And can they be safely integrated back into society?
Yeah, Lou, look, it's no surprise. We talked about this before Gascon's decision. This has been his policy for nearly 4 years since he's been in office, that he likes to rehabilitate, people that have committed crimes, for better or worse. I'm not going to take a view on that. But so this shouldn't be a surprise to everybody that he thinks that the Menendez brothers, because they have behaved in prison, that they can be effectively be rehabilitated. Remember, Gascon's been talking for weeks now about how he's resentenced, I think, 300 defendants. Only 14 of those have recommitted crimes. So that said, not a big surprise with him endorsing the resentencing. But one thing I want to be clear for your viewers is this does not magically mean that the Menendez brothers are going to be released from jail at the end of November. In fact, I'm not even sure I agree with the deputy district attorney who spoke. She said they're filing a petition tomorrow. She expects the judge to rule on that at the next hearing. I highly doubt that. I think what the judge is going to do is get all these legal documents filed, and then he or she's going to say, we need to have another hearing. We need to consider this evidence. We need to have evidence in court. For example, a forensic psychologist to come in and talk about this before the judge makes a final decision on whether there is resentencing. And then if there is a decision in favor of the Menendez brothers, then like Gascon said, then it gets out of the court system and then into the parole board, into the prison system. But this is not some, click your fingers and they're out of jail.
Okay. All right, Brian Claypool, thank you for your insight of the situation. Again, District Attorney George Gascon will recommend that the Menendez brothers, who have spent nearly 35 years in prison for the murder of their parents, be resentenced to 50 years to life with the possibility of parole.